Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, March 7. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times news organization, and has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives for the Universal Peace Federation to Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry. And I want to welcome our audience throughout the world. The special program today is Leadership and Issues, Analysis of Putin, Xi, and Kim, Axis Challenging Democracy. We have a very special panel and also a keynote speaker today. Our moderator is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, and Joe is the commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was special envoy for negotiations with North Korea, the director of National Counterproliferation Center, and associate director of national intelligence. On our panel is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Affairs at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is also an adjunct professor of Korean Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. And he is also at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Our special guest speaker today is really an outstanding expert, especially on China. Dr. Kenneth Dekleva is a senior fellow at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. He's a clinical psychiatrist and former senior U.S. diplomat, and he spent 5 years in Moscow as a regional medical officer psychiatrist with the U.S. Department of State. He has given numerous presentations in academic, media, and U.S. government settings in the field of leadership analysis, including profiles of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un. I'd like to turn this over to our moderator right now, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Joe, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. It's an honor being here with all of you. And certainly Dr. Dekleva today. This is a very special occasion for us and our audience. We'll be hearing about the axis of anti-democracy leaders today. We'll be talking a little about China and the National People's Congress that's going on today as we speak, where China has committed to a 7.2% increase in their defense spending, and they're looking at a modest growth rate of around 5%. We're talking about the second year of the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the second year of that war and the devastation that's going on as we speak. And we're talking about North Korea that's launched a number of intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the whole of the United States. And we will talk a little, and maybe some questions will come up about what's even going on in Iran, where they're enriching uranium at a higher level, so that it's a question of a few weeks before they can get to a nuclear capability. So there's so many issues on the table here. And what an honor it is to have Dr. Dekleva with us today to talk about the leaders of these countries that have caused a lot of concern throughout the world. And some would say a world that's in disarray. So Dr. Dekleva, thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador DeTrani, and thank you to Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Mansourov and to Larry for inviting me and facilitating me. I was looking at and listening to some of the past episodes. I'm perched on the shoulders of many giants who have been on this program, so I'm really, really honored. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes because I really want a lot of time for Q&A. I've had a long interest in leadership analysis of studying our adversaries that goes back to the mid-90s when I became interested with my mentor and friend and colleague, the late Dr. Gerald Post, who founded a center that does this kind of analysis when he was at CIA for about 2 decades and later at George Washington University. And we studied adversary leaders such as Dr. Radovan Karadzic and the late Slobodan Milosevic. And then my interest continued all along during my diplomatic service, certainly during my time in Russia, when I had a chance to see Russia change and evolve, both during my first tour in the early 2000s and my second assignment there from 2010 to 2013, and really get a firsthand look at the leadership style of Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And I think it's important, more so than ever, as Ambassador DeTrani said, we live in a much more complex world of increasingly great power competition. What in the National Intelligence Estimate in 2022 was referred to as a multipolar world. And I think that makes it in a way more complex. And I think a deep understanding of these leaders' psychology and style can help us try to understand what their objectives are, both tactically and strategically, how they might respond to crises, and how to negotiate with them. This is a really big question that has come up, certainly in the case of Chairman Kim of North Korea during 2018 and 2019, when there was a flurry of negotiations with world leaders, including then President Trump, President Putin, President Xi, then President Moon, and other leaders. So we've seen the importance of negotiation psychology there. Certainly that issue has been raised now with President Putin. Can he be negotiated with? Is there a way to negotiate an end to this brutal genocidal war in the Ukraine? And the same holds for China's President Xi Jinping, who was recently elected to an unprecedented third 5-year term. And how do we understand what his long-term strategic goals are, the great Chinese dream of rejuvenation, which he wants to accomplish by 2049. And what does that mean in the nearer future in terms of Taiwan? So there are a lot of challenging issues, and leadership analysis can be seen as another piece of the intelligence analysis puzzle that helps us understand particularly more opaque authoritarian leaders where there's a high degree of centralization of power. Let me summarize briefly what we know about these leaders. They certainly can be characterized by what I call the 3 R's. That would be they are all ruthless, they are rational leaders, and they're amazingly resilient. I point out their resilience because we've often in the US policy, national security, and intelligence community been dreadfully wrong about these leaders and their remarkable strength. The young leader, Kim Jong-un, when he took power in December of 2011 following his father's death from sudden cardiac arrest and following a stroke, which Chairman Kim Jong-il had a devastating stroke in August of 2008, was not predicted to last more than a few weeks or months. And if so, there would be a regency involved. Well, we know now he's entering his 11th year of power. Likewise, President Xi was thought to be unremarkable, and in a famous 2009 US cable from Beijing, he was felt to be a mere apparatchik and a leader of average intelligence. So I think we missed a lot of key points there. President Putin has often been underestimated. People, and this is still a debate that continues today, and I think we'll have on this show today, is he's seen as a lucky leader or as merely a tactical leader and not a strategic leader. I think that's wrong. As a friend of mine in the intelligence community once asked me, how many successes and victories does a leader have to have before we call him strategically successful? So I think these are things we're thinking about, the biases that creep into play with these leaders. To understand them, we have to not only go back and look at their formative experiences in childhood and in young adulthood. For example, with Chairman Kim, his time spent in Europe, his time away from his family, the loss of his father, who he was very close to. All of us have seen photos and video of Chairman Kim weeping at the cortege at his father's funeral procession in December of 2011. Vladimir Putin, a child of the post-war, but with war-weary, traumatized parents who grew up in Moscow, in Leningrad, in a small little kind of apartment called a kommunalka, and trying to understand his sensitivities and what shaped him into the type of leader that he's become. Likewise with Xi, who was the child of privilege. His father was one of the youngest vice ministers in the 50s and a veteran of working with Chairman Mao, one of the founders of the PRC. So a child who grew up in the penthouse, but then after his father was purged, spent 8 long years digging ditches in a remote province in Shanxi in China. And he's spoken about this in a rare interview that he gave in 2000 and how it strengthened him. And he wrote, "The knife is sharpened on a stone." And to paraphrase him, that's how we develop our character. And when he makes difficult political decisions, he always harkens back to that time. So I think it's important to understand the leadership psychology of these 3 leaders and looking forward to see them as not as ideologically rigid, even though in many ways they can be, but they've all shown over time a kind of tactical flexibility to reverse course and to do what's best for their country. The other interesting thing that I think will come up in the discussion is kind of the relationships between these 3 leaders and how that we have to be careful of our biases not to overvalue that. But these are very remarkable leaders. President Putin is a highly intelligent, strategic leader who all of us remember his famous 2001 speech to the Bundestag, where he spoke of Russia as being a part of Europe, and he spoke in German, and he got a standing ovation. We know with Chairman Kim, as was spoken by Andy Kim on this show I think a few months ago, he saw him, and others have seen him, as a very confident, dynamic, very much in charge leader who was completely aware of all the facts and was able to, in negotiations, dispense with his briefing points. And the former Russian ambassador to South Korea, Gleb Ivashentsev, said, "This is a young leader who in 2018 and 2019 held his own, meeting with confidence with the most powerful leaders in the world on multiple occasions." And with Xi, what we know from Xi is what the late Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew said about him. He spoke of his gifts and his inner strength, his psychological strength, a Nelson Mandela kind of leader. These are high words of praise. So I think we should sort of put aside a lot of our biases and try to understand these leaders in a deeper way, and we can talk in our discussion how they see their countries moving forward in a multipolar, rather disruptive world, and how the United States and its allies, both in Europe and Asia, can respond to these leaders. I think I'll stop because I really want a lot of give and take in the discussion. But once again, thank you, Ambassador DeTrani and Dr. Jenkins, for hosting me on this program.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dekleva. Outstanding comments, and I'm going to look to Alexander. You spoke about these 3 leaders in very detailed form, really painting a picture of very dynamic leaders who indeed know where they want to go, and they have a strategy for getting there. But again, we're a lot of conflict going on, and I think this is where we'll get into it. And we'll be asking you, Dr. Dekleva, how you see the future unraveling in regards to, you talked about Taiwan, you mentioned Kim Jong-un and being very confident, but we also see him now saying South Korea is an enemy, and the U.S. will continue to be hostile, and most recently even talking about if we should ever take down an ICBM, one of their ICBMs, he would view that as an act of war. So a lot of potential there. And again, the second we're into the second year of war in Ukraine and the devastation going on. So yeah, let's get into this conversation. And Dr. Mansourov, over to you, please.
Hey, thank you, Ambassador DeTrani, and good day to everybody. It's a real honor to be speaking at the same panel as Dr. Dekleva. Thank you very much for your outstanding remarks. Let me, I have a lot of questions. As Ambassador DeTrani said, there's a lot to discuss, and I hope later we'll get into some of those issues, including the recent developments in the South Korean-Japanese relationship, a major breakthrough in that relationship. Now, some very interesting statements coming from Pyongyang again in support of the Russian decision to suspend the New START treaty, as well as Russian signal to resume nuclear testing. And again, a lot of support coming from Pyongyang on that one. South Korean nuclear ambitions, I will be curious to know about your thoughts on that. But before we do, let me address some of the points you made about the three leaders, their styles, and the impact of these leaders on what's going on in the region today. Now, you said that, you know, 3 R's, ruthless, rational, resilient. That's your way to describe those leaders. And I would agree with 2 R's, rational and resilient. But in terms of being ruthless, at least, you know, with respect of one leader, and that is President Putin, I have some doubts about that. And the reason why I have some doubts about that is because to many observers, despite the image which you described, he comes across as a rather weak leader, fairly indecisive. The leader, he's a you know, very skilled at office intrigue, you know, great tactician. But I do not believe that he has that strategic vision which is required. Many people see him as a wishy-washy leader, kind of imitating more than delivering on what he promises. He tends to be late more often than not, and not just at summit meetings with other leaders, but also with decisions, critical decisions, which impact national security of his country. Again, he projects the image of someone who can be deceived again and again by his opponents, and yet he keeps stepping on the brake again and again. Finally, you know, after waiting way too much, he tends to snap and then makes those decisions which not necessarily are rational. So that's the way he comes across. Now, I don't want to comment about Kim Jong-un or Xi Jinping, not to take the time, but that's the image of President Putin many people have in their mind. And as you know, in Russian history, all rulers are usually kind of divided into 3 categories: outstanding, terrible, or mediocre. And the outstanding rulers, they tend to prioritize national and state interests over their private interests. They're usually strong-willed and hyperactive, and they define by themselves and carry out the state strategic agendas aimed at strengthening Russian national power. Catherine the Great, you know, Peter the Great, whatever. The terrible rulers, they tend to be active, but rather weak-willed. The wrong-headed actions mostly created problems for themselves and for the country, which they couldn't resolve. And they brought about many calamities to the state and Russian people, which sometimes led to catastrophic consequences. Finally, the mediocre rulers, they were passive and reactive. They tended to swim with the flow and cope with the rising problems with different degrees of success or failure. They had neither strategies nor long-term plans and prioritized the personal interests over national and state interests. And so I would ask you, in which category would you put President Putin, for example? Would you qualify him as a, outstanding ruler at par with Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, whatever, or a terrible ruler at par with, I don't know, President Gorbachev, maybe Ivan the Terrible, whatever? Or would you call him a mediocre ruler? Because the way how you classify him would tell us a lot about what you think really about his leadership and its impact on Russia. The second question, and I'll close here, Ambassador, deals with the inner circle. We know that the inner circle, whether it's the family members, whether it's lovers, childhood friends, mentors, military buddies, co-conspirators, spiritual soulmates, plays a significant role in leaders' decisions. The inner circle members, they could either reinforce or inhibit or enable the pathologies of rulers. So, but clearly members of the inner circle, they have better understanding of the character, the beliefs, the interests, the sensitivities of the rulers. They share values, often the worldviews. They have more access, more influence over the rulers. So, in my opinion, mediocre or terrible rulers, they rely more on their inner circle. They're more easily manipulated. Whereas outstanding rulers, they listen less to the inner circle and they act more autonomously and strategically. So what can you tell us, that's my second question, about the inner circles of President Putin, Chairman Kim, President Xi, and their role in shaping the behavior, the decisions of these rulers? So I'll stop here for now, Ambassador, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Dr. Mansourov. Over to you, Kenneth.
Okay, thank you. Interesting comments, Dr. Mansourov. Let me start with Putin. I think it's a mix in the sense that had President Putin retired or become an elder statesman, if you will, in 2012, after 2 terms as president and a term as prime minister, at that time, he probably would have been considered one of the greatest leaders in modern Russian history. Now, he had a lot of luck happen, but all good leaders have and need luck, whether they're in autocracies or democracies. That being said, I think now the risk is that he's really become more of a pariah. But again, we have to be careful not to let our pro-Western, pro-European, NATO, American biases creep in the sense that President Putin has sort of shifted toward the global South and toward closer alliances with China and other countries such as North Korea, his ongoing relationship with India and even Israel, with the current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with whom he's had a close relationship. So I think that if you look at the metric right now, the decision by President Putin to invade Ukraine and to begin this horrible genocidal war, which is going well, but which is not over yet either, tragically, it was a strategic intelligence failure. It leads to your second point, which is that during his first decade or more in office, President Putin had a much wider circle of people in the cabinet, in the National Security Council, and people that had inputs, people of immense talent. And I think the last several years, that inner circle is very much narrowed to where it probably was not just because of COVID, but it had narrowed politically for him and personally to include people such as the former FSB director and chairman of the National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and the FSB director, Alexandre Mansourov, and the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. So I think there's a much narrower view in terms of Putin, and I think that's a problem for all leaders, but especially for authoritarian leaders, that as they rely on a much more inner circle, they get a lot more rigidity in their decision making. I think his ruthlessness has been seen over and over. If you look at his behavior in the early 2000s vis-a-vis Chechnya, if you look at the assassination of Litvinenko in London in 2006 using a banned chemical weapon, if you look at the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, his role in Syria, and the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in 2018. He's shown an ability to do very ruthless things. But in terms of rationality, the challenging thing is to understand these leaders. We have to do something that's not very easy. We have to empathize with them and put ourselves in their shoes, which is a tough challenge. And I first learned this as a psychiatrist because I spent many years working in a jail and as a forensic psychiatrist interviewing murderers and rapists and child molesters. And to treat them and understand them, I had to set aside a lot of my natural built-in biases against people who do evil things. So I think that's how I see Putin. I think Putin sees himself as on a mission of destiny to recreate the pre-1991 borders of the former Soviet Union. And we have to listen to his words because he's not, what he's doing is horrifying, but he said this for many years. He told President Bush in the mid-2000s that Ukraine is not a real country, for example. So I think that's important to see. And I think in the case of the other leaders, they've repeatedly told us in their words what their aspirations and ambitions are. Certainly with Chairman Kim, he's an aspirational leader who in his earlier Beijing policy wanted to strengthen the military and the nuclear component, but also achieve a better life for the next generation of North Koreans. In this sense, he's an aspirational leader, kind of a millennial leader. What's fascinating about Chairman Kim is the role of women surrounding him in terms of the perfect question that Dr. Mansourov asks is, who does the leader trust? Well, we know Kim Jong-un trusts his sister. We know he trusts Choi Son-hui, who many of you have negotiated with and know well. And he trusts his wife, Ri Sol-ju. And now we've seen him sort of elevate his youngest daughter in the pantheon of the Mount Pictou lineage. And I think with Chairman Xi, with President Xi, it's even more challenging because it's still a very opaque system. But if you look at the selections in the recent Politburo Standing Committee, these are people who've been loyal and who are dedicated and who are really ideologically in step with President Xi's vision of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. And one of them, Wang Huning, was really the author of that during the first term of President Xi.
You know, Dr. Dekleva, outstanding comments. And thank you, Dr. Mansourov, for your questions. You know, empathy is one word I would find hard to use with any of those leaders that you've been describing, Dr. Dekleva. But let me pivot to Xi Jinping, if I may. We're witnessing the National People's Congress that's ongoing. We just heard from the premier, Li Keqiang, and who spoke about, you know, in sort of conciliatory terms, talking about peaceful reconciliation, peaceful reunification with Taiwan. Spoke about you know, the China is growing. It's not a threat to anyone. And then you contrast that with some of the comments that Xi Jinping even just recently made, not only in the past but recently made, about mainly the U.S. but others trying to contain, certainly the U.S. trying to contain China, and a sense of going back to the century of humiliation, starting with the you know, the Opium War in 1838 and going through the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So you see a sort of a contrast there with the Li Keqiangs and some of the people who have been close to Xi Jinping, and now he's moving a new group, a new cohort of loyalists in those positions, premier, the chairman of the Bank of China, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you see that? I mean, do you see that as enlightened leadership on the part of Xi Jinping, or is this indicative of surrounding yourself with loyalists who would sort of feed into this groupthink that, you know, we're being besieged and everyone is trying to contain us, especially the US? And does that not translate, especially when we look at Taiwan and we talk about peaceful resolution of the issues with Taiwan, but and Xi Jinping has talked about, well, if we can't do it peacefully, we'll have to use kinetic means if necessary. So are we seeing a transfer in China where China will be, do you think Xi and those advisors to him will be a little more proactive, I would say a little more assertive, maybe even more aggressive in regards to their relationship with the United States, and ensuring that they reach out to the world and try to get as many supporters as they can, allies as they can, partners as they can, so that they would show that their form of governance, if you will, this autocracy, is much better than this democracy that we see in the United States and in the European Union, et cetera. How do you see that developing, Dr. Dekleva?
I think it's a great question. I think it's even more complex in the sense that President Xi, one of the ways that we can try to understand how this develops is look at his relationships with the other two leaders. And with President Putin, it's very interesting because there's been a lot of commentary in the media and the policy community that Russia is now weakened and that President Putin and Russia are the little brother to the big brother, or the junior partner in the relationship. But President Xi is very wise because he chooses his words carefully. Even if he believed that, he would never say anything that would make President Putin perceive that or feel that. And they've met over 30 times. But that being said, I think the interesting thing is granted, I think we're going to see a more assertive China. I think there are some positives. There's some silver lining even in the assertiveness. The appointment of China's ambassador to the U.S. Chief Minister, I think, is a good thing because he's traveled around the U.S. He's a recent appointee here, and he knows the U.S. well. So I think that having someone like that closer to the inner circle helps in the decision-making calculus. But I think the difficult thing is, what will President Xi do in the next couple of years? Will he become more assertive? Will we see a return of a more hyped up version of wolf warrior diplomacy? Or does President Xi, especially vis-a-vis trying to achieve peace in the Ukraine, can he become, in the words of Robert Zulik, pivot back toward being more of a responsible stakeholder, even though he's trying to achieve these grand aspirational goals for China, a China which he feels the U.S. is holding back. So I think that's important to think about. Vis-a-vis the relationship with Chairman Kim, I think the way I look at it is both vis-a-vis North Korea and the Ukraine. I think President Xi fears instability. And I think a status quo on the Korean peninsula, as long as certain red lines aren't crossed, such as a nuclear test by North Korea or any kind of kinetic actions, they prefer that kind of ecosystem of even a fragile stability to the risks of things that are unpredictable. And I think in that sense, in the Ukraine, President Xi is torn between realizing that the Ukraine war and his association with Russia is bad for China's brand worldwide. All the different polls show that China is viewed much more negatively than it was several years ago. And so Xi has to be aware of how China's soft power is in a way weakened and is not being utilized the way it was really during his first term. So I think those are important things that they have to think about moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Dekleva. Alexander, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador. And when I look at the title of our program today, the Russia, China, North Korea axis, it raises some questions in my mind. And I look at the Russian-Chinese relationship. Again, it's complex. On the rhetorical level, they talk about strategic partnership without limits. The sky is not even the limit. But the reality is the trade, $190 billion, is twice as smaller than Chinese-South Korean trade, for that matter, $360 billion. And most of the Russian-Chinese trade is in hydrocarbons. And again, it benefited from the spike in the global oil and gas prices and coal prices. But the reality is China has not endorsed Russian actions in Ukraine like Belarus did or like North Korea did. China basically has not supplied any lethal weapons or any weapons to Russia at all, unlike the United States to the other side, to Ukraine. So if you look at the Western allies and what they're doing for Ukraine, China basically is doing nothing other than providing some diplomatic cover very reluctantly to Russia. So I wouldn't be talking about an axis there. Now, if you look at Russian-North Korean relationship, despite Kim Jong-un basically falling overboard, with his statements of support for Russia, North Korea is one of the few countries which really sided with Russia in every single vote at the UN General Assembly, Human Rights Council, you name it, endorsing Russian annexation of 4 regions, Russian invasion, whatever. Kim Jong-un, his foreign ministry said that, Russia walked away from New START treaty. That's fine. That's excellent. We endorse that. If they wanted to resume nuclear testing, that's fine. We'll endorse that. And yet, Russia has done nothing, absolutely nothing, to even hint at any kind of support for North Korea. The country is starving. They just held a plenum, Central Committee plenum meeting to talk about agricultural issues. Russia is flushed with grain and wheat. They can basically deliver by train, 20,000, 100,000, 1 million ton of grain without violating any sanctions. And they're not doing it. Fertilizer, the same. They talk about sanctions, that they're abiding by the UN Security Council sanctions, but there are so many ways how Russia can help North Korea, and yet they're not doing it. And even on the weapons side, I know for strategic communications purposes, we're saying that North Korea might have supplied some ammunition to the private military company in Russia in November last year. But again, that's our strategic communication effort. I don't really believe that we're on solid ground there. So we don't see any cooperation on military, technical, or mill-to-mill issues there yet. So my question to you is, this so-called axis of Russia, China, North Korea, is it real, or is it just a product of our imagination? I know why we would be kind of trying to highlight those emerging elements of cooperation between these 3 countries, which didn't exist before. But really, if you look at what we and our allies are doing on the other side, helping Ukraine, can you really say that, this is a kind of the tough axis we have to counter today? Maybe in the future, 10 years from now, we'll get to that point. But today, is it real, or is it just a product of our imagination, despite the fact that they're all run by 3 autocrats who are rational, who are resilient, and 2 of them are pretty ruthless? I agree with you.
Those are fascinating comments, Dr. Mansourov. I think you're right in the sense that while it's on the surface real, I too have a lot of questions behind the scenes and reading between the words. your points about the Russian-North Korea axis are very well taken, that Russia has not helped with grain deliveries, and North Korea has not accepted vaccines as it slowly begins to emerge from COVID, from the strictest lockdown in the world, has not accepted vaccines even from China. So I think those are interesting comments in that regard. The way I see the other piece of the Russia China axis is that I think China, like you said, is trying to hedge its bets and wants to be seen in one way as enhancing their brand as a trading partner with many, many countries, a huge trading partner around the world, including with Europe. And at the same time, they don't want to throw President Putin under the bus because they fear what happens after Putin and any kind of chaos, any kind of a 21st century version of the time of troubles, if you will. So I think that's where they're being careful. The other part is the nationalist part that's woven into the great Chinese dream of rejuvenation. And there have been postings in the last several years on Sina Weibo that much of the Russian Far East used to be part of China. So I think that's an issue that no one talks about, but it's there, and you have this very nationalistic cadre of a generation of young bloggers and people that have some influence in what will shape China over the next several decades, and they believe that's part of China, not part of the Russian Far East. So I think in the sense of buying oil, he's buying oil at reduced prices from China. So it really is an asymmetric relationship, even though the words suggest that it's a partnership without limits and one where they think alike and have met over 39 times. I think we have to be careful not to overvalue the latter.
Right.
You know, thank you for those answers, Dr. Dekleva. Let me pivot to just a few comments and then this question. You know, when you look at U.S.-China relations and you go back to 1978 when Deng Xiaoping took over, it was the United States. And indeed, the United States was there for China. And we were there to go up to 2001, the World Trade Organization. And it was U.S. foreign direct investment into China, et cetera. So, and over 300,000 Chinese students in the United States. So there's a bond there with the People's Republic of China and the United States, a very close one. And it's very tragic to see, and that's the word I'll use, tragic to see the tension in this relationship right now. And then Russia and their commitments to Ukraine in 2004, the US and the UK and Russia gave security assurances to Ukraine that gave up its nuclear weapons, and certainly for North Korea, the Kim Jong-un, but Kim Jong-il, his father, and even Kim Il-sung reaching out and saying they wanted a normal relationship with the United States, but on their terms. So there are pieces there that speak about a relationship now between these adversarial players. So my question to you, Dr. Dekleva, is how now, understanding these leaders the way you do, how does one reach out and without giving anything away and ensuring that there's peace and it's equitably resolved, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's a relationship with North Korea, but there's a lot of human rights issues with North Korea. We're very much concerned with how 26 million people are being treated in North Korea. And we don't want North Korea with nuclear weapons. And certainly with China, we don't want to be adversarial, but we want to see peaceful resolution to Taiwan. How would you script a strategy for the, if you will, for the democracies, if you will, again, I'll use that term, the democracies to reach out and to say to these autocratic leaders, to say, look, conflict is not in your interest or anyone else's interest. What approach would you take to reconciling some of the issues now that are so profound and that could lead us into, or maybe we may be even in it, into a new Cold War that can turn very hot very quickly.
Yeah, Ambassador DeTrani, what is needed now, and you know this better than anyone, is diplomacy. We need highly skillful diplomacy, and more than ever, in dealing with Russia, in dealing with China, in dealing with North Korea. A turning away from diplomacy is not going to get us the strategic successes that we need in managing the relationships. I hate to say this on this program, but I think strategic patience 2.0 is not working. And I think trying to, you're correct that the relationship with the People's Republic of China, which has had bipartisan support for decades since 1972, is now at probably its lowest point since the establishment of relations in 1979. And I think figuring out how to reestablish some kind of diplomatic connectivity where we can have meaningful but very difficult and challenging diplomatic conversations with our counterparts is going to be critical in the next few decades of the 21st century. And I think that's true with Russia as well. And an America that leads not only militarily and strategically and economically, but also diplomatically, is more important than ever. An America that turns inward away from the thickets and brambles of very difficult diplomacy. And those of you that have done this kind of diplomacy, Dr. Mansourov and Ambassador trying to know how difficult it is. But I'm fully in line here with what Robert Carlin and Chung-Hyun Moon have written in their book, Understanding North Korea, that the only answer to these types of really hard challenges is very, very skillful diplomacy. And diplomacy needs good intelligence to give it a ballast and a foundation so that our diplomats and negotiators have the best possible facts, free of a lot of contaminating biases, in order to deal with these very difficult autocratic leaders. And to highlight, once again, dealing with them means trying to put ourselves in their shoes. Empathy doesn't mean we agree or support what they're saying, but the ability to humanize them, I think, and to try and understand where they've been, what they want, where they're going, and what kind of leadership outcomes or governance outcomes they seek will help inform better diplomacy.
No, those are excellent comments. Thank you, Dr. Dekleva. Let me just follow up on that and then go right to Alexander on that. We now have in the House of Representatives, we have a new committee that will be looking at China. We see the media, and it seems to be a significant consensus that China is the adversary, if not the enemy, and things seem to be getting worse. So do you think putting diplomacy into the equation now in a more meaningful way could ameliorate some of these trend lines? Or do you think we need to, or we, the corporate we, the international community and our allies and partners, we need to be more creative, and how would that be addressed in China with the Xi Jinping that's talking about, the national security law in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and what's happening in the South China Sea, and now trying to intimidate Taiwan? Do you think any effort on our part will be meaningful if we see this sort of behavior from China?
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani. I think in baby steps, yes. I'm trying to be an optimist here. We have dealt with a difficult China in very difficult times. If we look back at our history of U.S.-China relations and how President Nixon's historic 1972 trip came about, the seeds of that were planted in the late 60s. So there were several years of great difficulty and a lot of very delicate situations and possible misunderstandings, all in the context of the Vietnam War. So we're very fortunate that we have the the incredibly skilled, talented diplomats, intelligence officers, and military officers to deal with this, but we need leadership at the policy level that says engagement, even in these very difficult times, is worthwhile. And I think the other factor that's playing into this, the subtext of what you said, Ambassador DeTrani, is there's a tendency on the part of Chairman Kim, President Putin, and President Xi to not engage as much right now and to really play a wait and see game and see what happens in our country in 2024. I think that will be very fateful.
Thank you, Dr. Dekleva. Alexander, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to go back to your observation, Ambassador, that the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which offered security guarantees to Ukraine in exchange for its denuclearization, the guarantees offered by United States, Great Britain, and Russia, that memorandum is dead now. Of course, President Putin's decision to suspend Russian participation in the START treaty also is not good news for strategic arms control, and it sets a bad precedent, another bad precedent. Again, Russian willingness to resume nuclear testing also does not kind of offer much hope. So with all that kind of negative news about strategic arms control results, my question to you, Ken, is how do you think this might impact the prospects for the resumption of denuclearization talks on the Korean Peninsula? I know we talked about diplomacy, it's a good thing, but, you know, the last existing strategic arms control agreements are on the way out, if not dead already. I don't think Russia will come back to that START treaty in the remaining 2 or 3 years. So, you know, what kind of message does it send to Pyongyang? Not only, you know, with Budapest Memorandum being dead, so what's the point of getting these guarantees? But even when, you know, you get them, you know, relations can change, and within 5 or 10 years, you know, they can be disrupted, and then, you know, what's the point of these denuclearization talks to begin with? So I'm curious about I know you say diplomacy is important, but today, I mean, do you think really the prospects for the denuclearization talks in whatever format, bilateral, trilateral, six-party, whatever, do you think they're almost nil, zilch, or you still have like some hope? And if you do, then what are the grounds for you being hopeful?
I'm not hopeful. It's a pipe dream, long-term perhaps, but I think we have to listen to what the North Koreans have told us over a very long time, which is they want to be accepted. They want relations with the US, but they want relations where they are accepted as a nuclear power, which they have been since 2006, similar to Pakistan. That is something they've told us over and over. And I know Ambassador DeTrani has sat in the room with his North Korean interlocutors and heard this. So I think that's what they want. The important thing is they don't see themselves as being disruptors with that type of strategy, even though, as Ambassador DeTrani has pointed out, the risks of accepting North Korea formally as a nuclear power, not just de facto, has to do with the risk of further proliferation in Asia, and that's a huge risk in that sense. But I think the Ukraine war has taught them that lesson, that, as you said, the Budapest 1994 memorandum shredded, and I think that they've taken that lesson to heart. I think the important thing that we've seen them is that they're not. It's easy to see on the surface the North Koreans as disruptors, but I think they have relations with the US where they're accepted. I don't see China or President Xi as a disruptor. They just want more seats at the table, which dovetails and aligns with President Xi's dream of rejuvenation for the Chinese people. The real disruptor in this trio is President Putin, where he's engaged in warlike acts in the worst war in Europe in many decades, probably since World War II, with a complete disruption, 8 million refugees, and the complete destruction of the Ukraine, which will cost anywhere from $1 to $2 trillion and generations to rebuild. This is really a tragedy. So the real disruptor in this trio has turned out to be President Putin.
Okay.
So can
May I follow up quickly,
Go
Ambassador?
ahead.
Speaking about the disruptors, of course, in the Republic of Korea, we see growing nuclear ambitions among the South Korean public, the South Korean leadership, and that could really disrupt at least the existing status quo in which North Korea has the nuclear capability. The South relies on its nuclear umbrella with the United States. So I know we don't really have much time, but I'm really curious about your thoughts on South Korean nuclear ambitions and how that could change, that could disrupt the existing status quo on the peninsula with all the potential consequences. If we have a couple of minutes.
Yes, go right ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll let Ambassador DeTrani speak about that, but I think it's South Korea obtaining nuclear weapons would be extremely disruptive.
No, and I would agree with that. I think it would be disruptive for South Korea. I mean, economically it would be a disaster for South Korea, and the nuclear supplier group would not be able to provide the, if you will, the fuel necessary to support the South's peaceful nuclear energy needs, and also export-wise and credibility-wise. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why, and part of that also is our deterrence, where we've enhanced our nuclear deterrence and committed to extended nuclear deterrence, that nuclear umbrella, making it very clear we're there for South Korea. I think that's all part of the equation. You know, going back to Dr. Mansurov's question to you, Dr. Dekleva, North Korea has said often in negotiations, accept us as a nuclear weapon state, and we'll be friends of the United States. And I think both of you are correct. The 1994, the Budapest Memorandum is indicative of the fact of, and it confirmed what North Korea would always say to the U.S. in negotiations. Security assurance is a piece of paper, you could tear it up. But when we dismantle our nuclear weapons capabilities, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure that we're doing away with. So there's no comparison. And our response has always been, but normal relations with the United States, a normal relationship, diplomatic relationship, would be your best security assurance. And I think that's where North Korea wants to go. So my question to you, Dr. Dekleva, is if indeed North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States and doesn't want to be just tethered to China for the future, do you see our strategy towards North Korea as being a viable one when we're talking about complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement? Or do we need to be a little more flexible? Because I'm an advocate for CVID, complete, verifiable dismantlement of all nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities, to include the highly enriched uranium facilities. Is that realistic? And if it's not realistic, how would you approach this?
I think it has to be in a stepwise fashion, because the North Koreans have told us, and through their recent actions with their increased missile testing and improvements in the Hwasong 15 and the next generation, the Hwasong 17 missiles, that they're moving forward with their nuclear program. So I think that some type of diplomacy where you have incremental gains is probably going to be more successful with Chairman Kim than trying to go for broke. I think we saw that in Hanoi in 2019, and the results were disappointing.
How would you get them back to the table, Dr. Dekleva? They're refusing to talk.
Answer to that. I think the as you know better than most of us, Ambassador DeTrani, I think they're going to wait till after 2024. I don't think we'll get them back to the table with our current policy of strategic patience. And North Korea is not a top of the line issue right now for the Biden administration, the way other issues such as China and the Ukraine and Russia are. But I think after 2024, it will depend on the next leadership in the White House.
What a great discussion. Dr. Dekleva, I can't thank you enough. And thank you for the great work you continue to do. You're just a great asset for this country, and we're so proud of you. Thank you, Dekleva.
Thank you for your kind words. It's a real honor and pleasure to be on your show and to see all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Michael Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And as always, your moderation really helps bring the most interesting discussion forward. Dr. Mansourov, thank you for your incredible insights and also always looking into areas that most scholars would not be able to touch. And Dr. Dekleva, it's been a great program and we learned a lot today and we want to have you back. I want to thank our sponsors, the Universal Peace Federation and the Washington Times Foundation. And also I want to thank the Washington Times newspaper, which covers our program, and that helps to extend our coverage to Seoul, Korea, because usually it's picked up by the media there. It's so relevant what we're doing, and this area of the world is the crucial area of focus if we're concerned about peace. And I think we're helping with this effort today and this dialogue. I want to thank everybody, and especially thank you to Congressman John Doolittle, who's our representative of the Washington Brief to Congress and to other intelligence circles. And we're very happy he's here with us today. Thank you all. And we're here every first Tuesday to give enlightenment and understanding about Northeast Asia and the challenges we face with China and North Korea and Russia. Thank you very much.